Alright, Chapter 9 is the chapter that deals with nonverbal communication, and here you essentially have the messages of your body, of your behavior, of how you control things like time and the use of space, silence, and interesting things like that. Nonverbal communication is a huge area. It's very, very large, and you take that in combination with the area of culture, which is equally as large, and try to put the two together and cover them in a single chapter, and you have an impossible task. So nonetheless, that's what we are going to attempt to do in this particular chapter. So the first thing that your book goes into is this notion of the fundamental key ideas of the chapter that sort of gives you an idea of where the chapter is going to go. And basically we're going to explore the notion of the functions of communication, offer you a definition, some key things in terms of studying nonverbal communication. This has a lot to do with the classification or the categories of nonverbal, which is of course the next area. And then lastly it will close on ways to improve your nonverbal communication behavior. What I'd like you now to look at is I'm going to give you some pictures of images, and there's no sound spoken, and yet consider the messages that are received. Okay, so as you can see from just a quick slide through of different images, there are a lot of messages that are received from nonverbal communication, and I think that's just a quick illustration, and honestly could have gone on and on. So like I said, these are the key ideas that are discussed in the class, and first is examining the notion of functions. And nonverbal communication functions in several ways. It certainly expresses internal states, in terms of we make judgments about how we feel. Emotions are conveyed through our posture, through our face, certainly our eye contact, our vocal qualities convey a condition of mood and emotion. Has a lot to do with establishing your identity, how somebody's dressed in terms of clothing. Along with that, you add things like piercings and tattoos. It is simply another way of incorporating identity. So in terms of regulating interaction, we have things that we do non-verbally that regulate conversation the same way that we have stoplights and street lights and stop signs on the road that regulate traffic. And we do them in very subtle, very distinct ways in our interaction with each other. And certainly it can work to repeat. If I wave and say hi, if I wave instead of a hi, obviously repetition and substituting are fairly clear there. This is the definition that is given to you in your textbook, and it's somewhat of a fairly straightforward definition. I think it's important to understand that it involves all those nonverbal stimuli in a conversation. That means both intentionally communicated and unintentional. Those messages do not have to be deliberate. Okay, they can be unconsciously sent. That it is both verbal and nonverbal in terms of the different types of messages that we send, and this chapter is going to focus in on the nonverbal aspect. It's often very difficult to separate the two, not as clear as you think it ought to be or it should be. Okay, so next, looking at studying nonverbal communication, a couple of principles for you to understand regarding nonverbal, and this is as a whole, as an entirety, is nonverbal itself can be a little bit ambiguous. What that means is that meaning is a little bit less clearly defined as in verbal communication. It's less concrete. It can be a little bit more abstract. There are many factors that influence nonverbal communication. Certainly there are certain rules that are contextual, in other words based on the situation. There are certain things that mean something in a baseball game where that gesture might not have that basic meaning in a conference boardroom. So, there can be many different meanings. Now, there are universals, as your book talks about, and nonverbal communication is learned. It's something that you are taught to by your culture, by your family, by your educational system, and by the society in which you live. And different cultures have different rules for nonverbal communication in a lot of different areas. And for example, I have down here facial expression as being one of those. Okay, so now we're going to get to some of the fun stuff, which is the classification. And the first is the messages of the body. When it comes to the notion or the discussion of appearance, that connects to a lot of things, the least of which is beauty. I want you to look at something here. If I were to ask you, looking at these women, how would they rank in terms of beauty to you? Society gives you definitions, oftentimes based on appearance, of a beautiful person. And here we have 6 women, all by some cultural definition as beautiful, and yet some we would have a difficult time with, and some we have a difficult time even understanding, and others we immediately gravitate to. And so the notion of appearance in that regard is pretty straightforward and pretty clear. Other things in terms of general appearance, there are Malaysians who do the earlobes, as you saw in that one photograph. Others who do the neck, piercings, certainly skin color, tattoos, a lot of things regarding appearance as well as body. Clothing will vary in terms of what is considered decent or respectable, and certain things that would not faze anything here cause great ruckus. When I was in India, I thought my sleeveless dresses, because I was worried about the length, they were long, they were knee-length sleeveless dresses, I thought they were perfectly fine. And I had no idea that exposing the upper part of my arm was considered revealing, which was odd to me considering in many saris, the Indian women's dress, their entire midriffs were exposed. So it didn't even occur to me that my upper arms in a sleeveless sundress would be a problem. And this is with big wide straps, but it made a difference. Body movement. It's amazing to me that under this notion of kinesics, it's so big, there is so much covered in this particular section of the textbook. And kinesics covers everything from your posture, to your use of gestures, to your facial expressions, to something we call affect displays. Very interesting in terms of what cultures teach you about when to smile, when not to smile. About eye contacts, that's a field that we call oculesics, which is the study of the eyes and direct eye contact and what that means in terms of respect or disrespect. Even vocalics technically falls under this entire category, this huge umbrella of a subject matter called kinesics. I have a graph I want you to look at, and it's very interesting when it comes to vocalic. Okay, vocalics, like I've said before, is a part of, your book is considering it under haptics, which is a little bit unusual. It's also called paralanguage, as it says here. And this is the vocal tonality. We're talking pitch, highs and lows. The top is of a typical Caucasian. A little bit flatter is the bottom one, which is an Asian. In the middle is a Latin American vocal pattern. Now imagine the perception in terms, look at the variation within the category that they designated as Asian, the vocal pattern, and look at the Latin. And by the way, African Americans are very similar to Latin with a lot of highs and a lot of lows. Imagine the perceptions. You know, what is your Latin individual going to think in a conversation? What's his or her perception going to be when they're having a conversation with somebody from an Asian culture, and vice versa? And so different subtleties that are, to me, very intriguing in terms of differences. So that's vocalics. Something else your textbook discusses a little bit is this notion of durians. This is, or rather, olfactics. Olfactics is the study of smell. The picture here is of a durian, and it's a very unusual looking fruit that's common in Malaysia and different parts of the Far East. Very odd looking thing. I encountered these when I was in Singapore, and there were signs on the MRT, on the subway, that said no durians allowed. And I remember thinking that was a bit odd. I felt bad for the durian people who were not allowed to travel on the subways, until I realized what one was. And the reason no durians are allowed on the subway or in taxis or on buses is because they are the most god-awful smelling thing. They reek, they stink. Okay, that whole discussion of the durian was all about that field of olfactics, the study of smell. Smell is basically a stimulus response type phenomena, and the response is what is culturally learned. My response, my culturally learned response to the durian was obviously not a positive one. I've encountered many students who've come from the Middle East where there is not nearly the obsession to cover up, for example, body odor as there is in American culture. And as a result, there's been a lot of tension and friction when placed in groups with American students, and they talk about the smell. There's oculesics, the study of the eye and the use of that in nonverbal communication. Touch, something called haptics. Sidney Girard did an interesting study where he compared the amount of contact, physicality, touch that occurred amongst people in a given conversation. In Puerto Rico, it was 180 touches per hour. In Paris, France, it was around 50. In London, England, it was 0. And in our own Gainesville, Florida, it was 2. So touch is culturally determined. Then of course there's seating, there's arrangement. Your book talks a lot about the use of silence and its power and its influence, time, and things like that. So those are just a few of the relatively large topics that are covered under the heading kinesics. There's a lot of material there, and so you can take your time, certainly go to the book for details on that section. Okay? Space and distance, the next big issue. A lot of things are covered here. With the notion of personal space, there are 4 fundamental personal space zones that are important for you to understand. Your book talks about them. Personal, intimate's the first one. Personal, social, professional, and public is the 4th one. So those 4 personal space zones. And all cultures have them, but the sizes will vary somewhat. Seating arrangements. Time has to do with not only the time orientation of a particular culture and things like what's called informal time and how punctual a particular cultural group is. It also studies things like the pace, how quickly people walk, the pace of life, the amount of time there is between a question being asked and the answer being given. There are some cultures that have what we would call a negative response latency. What that means is basically interrupting, that there is a negative amount of time between the question and the response. But predominantly, the biggest cultural aspect of time, and by the way, time is called chronemics, if you're looking for the big formal term, is this idea of monocratic and polychromatic time, and with what the book calls M time and P time. I'll have you do a quiz, sort of a survey on yourself later on to see if you tend to be monocratic or polychromatic. Okay, and then your book goes into oodles and noodles of information on silence, and I am going to completely skip over that in the lecture here. You can examine that. It gives you some specific cultures and things like that. I want to close this rather long video lecture. So far we're at 15 minutes. And talk about different ways to improve your nonverbal communication skills. You certainly, these 5 particular variables will go a great way toward making you more nonverbally competent. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Like I said, 2 huge subjects merged together.